I've always heard that people don't like to follow dogs or children. I feel like following Dr. Martson is putting me at a disadvantage. That was a very impressive presentation that she gave, and I really totally agree with the idea that most things take a system, and it really needs to work. What I'd like to talk about today is sort of the journey that led to the development of effective leadership programs for women. And one of the things that we definitely find that women have been in leadership positions for many, many years. The first recorded in history of a woman ruler was Hatshepsut. I wish she had an easier name to pronounce, but that's what it is. And she was the first female and the longest ruling pharaoh of Egypt back in 1508 to 1478 BCE. Now, there may have been other women rulers back at that time, but the recorded history is so sparse that if there were women, nobody wrote about them. The next really woman we see written about is Cleopatra, who was also from Egypt. And the interesting thing, what I find is many of us think of Cleopatra as the lover of Mark Antony. But when I've been taking some Roman history courses, and they kept referring to her as a fierce competitor, because Augusta was very concerned that she should be defeated, that the Egyptian troops should be defeated. And so thought of her as a competitor. She was a true leader of Egypt. Then we have Boudicca. I don't know if you know Boudicca. She was a warrior queen of ancient Britain. And when the Nero came to Great Britain, is one of the things that it turned out she was raped, her children were killed. So she organized all of the tribes that were in what is now Great Britain, the Celtic nations, to try to drive out Nero's Roman forces. And they were very effective for a long time, but then Nero sent in more Roman soldiers, and unfortunately, she was killed, and it didn't work. But she was really a noted warrior back in those times. And then I have Joan of Arc, who most of us know, led the French army to victory in Orleans in 1429 against the English. Now, one of the things you find that all of these four women that I have were warriors. In ancient history, the more I've been studying ancient history, it's more fascinating. So what's old is new again. Only warriors were seen as fit leaders to rule or to lead in many parts of the world. If you weren't a warrior, if you weren't a soldier, then you wouldn't even be considered for a leadership position. Fortunately, times have changed, and we find that you don't have to be a warrior to be a leader. That we're a little bit better than that now. And as someone mentioned earlier, the other Beverlee, I think, was mentioned that the women's movement, at least in the US, started in the 19th century. This was when the suffragettes started and said they wanted the right to vote. And they started writing pamphlets, they distributed, they had civil protests, they marched, and the women really came out of, as I would say, the woodwork. And in the 20th century, of course, it turned out they were very successful in their one goal, which was the right to vote. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution gave women the right to vote. This was a monumental time for women because suddenly they could vote. Now, that was considered to be the first wave of women's movement. But as a couple of the other speakers talked about the 1960s movement, I'm going to call that my generation. That was referred to as the second wave of women's rights. And this had to do with abortion and all sorts of different things that started in the 1960s. And the two icons of that era were Betty Friedan, who wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And she was also the co-founder of the National Organization for Women in America. The other was Gloria Steinem. And she was the co-founder of a magazine called Ms. Magazine. Ms. was a term that came in the 1960s. Is suddenly people didn't want to be Mrs. or Ms., so they came up with the idea of MS. And in that magazine, it was all about women and everything. And I was an avid reader of Ms. Magazine for many years. And during that period of time, and when I read The Feminine Mystique was a few years after it came out, I was at sort of a transition point in my own life. The girls' school where I had taught was closed. It was a sort of a finishing school for girls. And it closed and I was out of a job and I was sort of bored. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know which direction to take. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I think most women at some point have said that, what do I do? Which direction do I take? I was married at the time, and my husband, I think, thought I was very difficult to live with because I was pretty bored. And he said, for heaven's sake, either get a job or go back to school. Well, I never thought about going back to graduate school. I'd already earned 2 bachelor's degrees. I had a degree in business and a degree in education. And so therefore, it never occurred to me. But we were living in Columbus, Ohio, where Ohio State University was located. And that's where I'd received both my undergraduate degrees. So I decided I'd go up and talk to them about graduate school. And at that time, Ohio State had a combined MBA PhD program. And I thought that was sort of interesting. So I thought about applying for that. So I approached 2 of my former professors, both males, to see if they would write letters of recommendation for me to go to graduate school. And the one was more than happy to do so. He said, well, you were always a good student. I'd be happy to do so. But the other professor said, well, I'm very uncomfortable doing this unless I talk to your husband and be assured that he's okay with you going to graduate school. Fortunately, my husband laughed about it and said, well, I'll go talk to him and tell him I think it's a great idea. But that was the time when many people, the husband had to approve of what the wife did. So I did go back to graduate school. And in graduate school, I entered the combined MBA PhD program, which was a 6-year program. So I graduated with both degrees. In the MBA classes, I was one of only 2 women in the MBA classes, and there were about 75 students in the MBA class. So we like 73 men, and Captain Madeline Moore of the U.S. Air Force. See, she was a warrior. Then when I got in the PhD work, I was the only woman in the PhD program in business at that time. When I was finishing up my degree and was applying for my first university job as an assistant professor, I found not all universities were really interested in talking to a woman. I found that the very top schools were willing to talk to me. I'm talking about the Harvards, UCLAs, the Stanfords would talk to me because I think they thought their reputation wouldn't be too damaged by hiring a woman. And then there were the small, struggling schools that were just trying to interview anyone because they needed someone to teach. It was a long series of what happened, but eventually I ended up at the University of Kansas, which was a tier 1 school. And I was the first woman hired by the business school. And a funny story about that is because I learned later that they had a big discussion of where to put my office, because the Summerfield Hall, which was the home of the business school, which was mostly built for men, only had women's restrooms on every other floor. Men's restrooms were on every floor, but women's restrooms were only on every other floor. And they couldn't decide whether to put me on a floor with the restrooms or put me on a floor with colleagues that I might do research with. Well, I ended up with colleagues I might do research with, is where I ended up, but I always thought that was a funny story. And my office was located, I was right beside a labor economist, Tony Redwood. And he and I became relatively good friends. And we were talking about many of the recruiters coming to the University of Kansas were wanting to hire women. Unfortunately, we had very, very few women graduating in the business program at that time. And so the two of us decided something had to be done about that. And we wrote a paper called The Women in Crisis, The Empty Pipeline. And the idea was that we were concerned that even though businesses were going out seeking women, there weren't enough women filling the pipeline. And that was a paper we presented at what I believe was the very first academic conference for women in business. It was held at the Mutt Foundation in Madison, South Dakota. Believe me, for those of you around the world, this is an impossible place to get to. It's in the middle of nowhere. There were only about 30 of us there, but I developed some very good friendships and relationships with other women who were working with in business in the pipeline. And so then what we did was try to start a really recruiting program for recruit business in the business program. And that was part of, I was a co-writer of the first affirmative action program. And one of the main goals I was concerned about is getting more women trained in the field of business at that time. Now, my husband took another job out of state, went back to Ohio. Long story short, I ended up at Wright State University, which was in Dayton, Ohio. Now, I was the first woman hired in the marketing department there. And this is the first university where I had a leadership position. I'd been well trained as a researcher. My researcher was very good. And they had a research center and they asked if I wouldn't like to be a director of the research center. It did grant and contract research. And so I thought that would be a great thing to do. I had 5 people working for me at the time, but it was the first time I really had anyone reporting to me that I was actually in a leadership position. Then later on, I was asked to chair the marketing department. It was a department of 9 people, 8 men and me. And I chaired the marketing department for quite a while. And while I was chairing the marketing department, I developed the first ever course, experimental course for women in business at the university. At that time, there weren't gender studies or women's studies courses or anything. And this was only approved on an experimental basis, of course, because it wasn't approved. Eventually, it was approved and it was called Women in Management. The university had a very robust executive development program. And so the leader of the director of that program asked if I wouldn't like to develop some seminars or programs for women in management to be offered to local businesses and on a subscription basis. I successfully developed and led many programs throughout the US. I led women in management, assertiveness training for women, conflict management for women, how to dress for success, communication skills for women, listening skills for women, you name it, motivation skills for women. I did the sort of a whole range of things. Also, when I was at Wright State, that was when accrediting agencies, in the US, we have regional accrediting agencies that accredit universities. And I was in what was the North Central region. That covers 19 states and 10,000 universities. Yes, an awful lot. At universities and colleges. And they were just beginning to hire women or bring in women to be on visitation teams on the accreditation work. And that is something that I've continued throughout my academic career. Then eventually I was asked if I wouldn't consider being a dean. And my first dean's job was at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside. And I was the first female dean in business Wisconsin system. I believe at the time, according to AACSB, I was one of only 15 female deans. Now there are well over several hundred in business. But when I was a dean, I found there really wasn't time to work with my seminars or to give seminars or anything else like that. And because I was totally consumed by running the college and by raising funds and by serving on boards, giving after dinner speakers, doing all the things that a dean does. But after a few years there, I was approached about if I would be interested in becoming the founding dean of business at California State University, San Marcos, which was a new university that was just starting up, the first new university in the California state system in 20 years. And so I was the founding dean of the College of Business Administration, and I also continued to expand my accreditation work. And I worked with the local business community. I was very involved with the business community. And when we talked about in the previous session of systems, I was a co-founder of the Enterprise Consortium. We decided we wanted to develop the economic engine of North County, San Diego, where my university was located. And that was bringing together businesses, educational institutions, and government. So it was a system, and we brought it together we knew we had to work together to improve the economy. Okay, after a few years of a lot of work, a lot of snoozing, a lot of raising money, a lot of things that I did there, I decided to take advantage of my retreat rights to the professorial position I had, which was going to give me a lot of freedom and opportunities to go back and do some of the things that I wanted to do because my time was not my own previously. And so I started revising some of my previous workshops for women. And I also re-energized my consulting business. I expanded my accreditation activities. Then I was in the Western part of the country and went into international accreditation. I also did visiting professorships in India, in Mexico, and different places around the world. And this was one of the things I found, the importance of networking and developing new contacts. And one of the things when I said old is new, a lot of revision, but new is new. This is how I became acquainted with ALUM and World Association for Sustainable Development. I was at a World Marketing Conference in Malta, happened to sit beside a wonderful person, Hyen Suk Lee. She's Korean, but she was teaching at the National University of Mexico. She and I got to talking, and we decided that eventually, after spending 2 days together at the conference, we wanted to work together. And we started working about what had happened to the NAFTA, the treaty between Mexico and the US, and what had happened to the labor market due to that. And she presented a paper at Wasson and said, this is an organization we should get to know. So that was how she and I wrote a paper, and I presented the paper at the Brighton conference. That's how I met Alum. So therefore, I found networking is very important as it expanded. I have since retired from full-time teaching, and I'm trying to adapt to changing times. But one of the things with new approaches, I just this past summer completed a 4-year program in liberal studies at the University of Chicago. And I studied the ancient philosophers. And one of the things that I found, this has given me a new perspective on many things. The old philosophers were struggling with the same things we are struggling with today, is change management. How do you deal with change? Anger management, all of these wonderful things. And reading these ancient philosophers and the history has given me a whole new perspective on the programs that I used to have. And so I have been updating and revising all the things that I used to do before. And that has resulted in this June, I will be presenting Developing Successful Leadership Styles for Women in a Changing Environment, because the environment is definitely changing. And I'll be presenting that in June. And just to give you an idea, I've really expanded and revised the topics. We'll be talking about the barriers of effective leadership and how to overcome them in different cultures, the characteristics of effective women leaders in different cultures around the world, because I've learned a lot by working and living in different countries now. And leadership styles, what works and what doesn't work depending on where you are. Communication skills, particularly the nonverbal, the public interface, networking, public speaking, and of course, these traditional leadership skills of change management, problem solving, decision making, energizing your team, handling politics and potential sabotage and difficult people. So this is what I'm going to be teaching or leading in June, and I hope some of you will join me. Okay, that's it.